In Kosovo, police scuffled with Pristina University students who were demanding the resignation of the school's rector. Special forces were called in to disperse the crowds. Students have been protesting for more than 10 days over corruption allegations against top university officials. In the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, about 2,000 anti-government protesters carrying shields and batons marched through the government district. Activists said the march was a reminder to the government of the demands of the ongoing mass demonstrations. The protesters want constitutional reforms, a resumption of the EU accession process, and the punishment of officials responsible for the abuse and killings of activists. In New York, activists called on the sponsors of the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi to speak out against what they considered to be anti-gay legislation in Russia. Gay rights activists took part in simultaneous protests in some 20 cities around the world on February 5th. Activists say the Russian legislation that forbids so-called gay propaganda is used to persecute homosexuals. In Moscow, filmmakers presented A Winter Path, a love story about two young gay men, at a screening for journalists ahead of the film's release in cinemas. The Russian Ministry of Culture had tried to prevent the film's distribution under recent legislation banning gay propaganda, but eventually allowed it to be distributed. In the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, civil society activists demonstrated against the construction of a hydropower plant in the mountains of the western Svaneti region. Protesters called on authorities to stop the Khudoni Dam project. Critics say that if the long-planned dam is built, a village and its old church will be underwater. In Armenia, protesters against a new pension reform law took to the streets of the capital, Yerevan. Hundreds of protesters chanted and distributed flyers against the legislation as they marched to the State Revenue Committee building, where they briefly scuffled with police. Opposition parties are challenging the constitutionality of the law, which requires employees to contribute an additional 5% of their salaries to privately owned pension funds. In Kyrgyzstan, lawmakers have endorsed a document that could pave the way for the joint ownership of the country's largest gold mine, Kumtor, with Canada's Centerra company. The document says that the Kyrgyz government and Centerra would each hold a 50% stake in a proposed new joint company which would own Kumtor. After the year 2026, the Kyrgyz government would have the option to increase its stake. Opposition parties and local residents have been demanding that Kumtor be nationalized. In Peshawar, northwest Pakistan, members of a teachers' association blocked a road as they demonstrated to demand promotions and pay increases. The teachers threatened to go on strike, saying that their promotions are long overdue and officials have instead promoted friends and relatives. Southern Tajikistan is suffering from an extreme cold snap. In the Kulab region, workers were trying to repair the roof of a recently constructed school that collapsed under the weight of heavy snowfall. Environmental activists in the region have asked residents to help feed wild animals to ensure that they survive the harsh winter. And that's the video roundup from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.